Well, we've got to 100 episodes. No one is more surprised about that than me. I joke that I have never done 100 of anything in my life apart from maybe rice. And I'd like to thank all of you who have listened, all of my guests who have given their time free of charge to me, and without them there would be no podcast. And before we start today's show, I want to do a bit of housekeeping. I've had a number of notes from people and emails, some of support, but a few of them asking questions. The most obvious question everyone asks me as soon as they know I'm doing a podcast is, how do I monetize it? The answer is this podcast has been a labor of love since we started in January 2016. I will say that for me it has been one of the best things I've done with my life. I have met so many interesting people who have shared their life experiences and wisdom and the things that have made all the difference and the errors that they've made in a very forthright and frank way. I've always had the feeling that this podcast would be a resource for younger people. Many of the people who I've had on the podcast have had difficult childhoods, or they've not known what they wanted to do when they were younger, and they share how they managed to get on the right track. And if one podcast of A Pint with Seaniebee causes one kid somewhere to see the light, to have a better life, then it'll have all been worth it. It gives me a great purpose to my own life since I sort of quit advertising and started writing, and I hope to continue with it. Some of the questions that came in, one person wanted to know what the top 5 episodes were. I have limited analytical data at my disposal thanks to SoundCloud, but I do know stuff like that. The top 5 episodes are episode 1 with Mundy, the Irish musician. Really appreciative in hindsight for him to be the first cab off the rank. He didn't know anything about what was coming, and neither did I. So thank you, Mundy, and I'd urge anyone to check out his music. He's one of the great Irish singer-songwriters. Number 2 on the list is episode 3, Nicola Cassio, a producer from Los Angeles. Number 3 is my good friend Andy Greenaway, a guy I've worked with for over 5 years out in Asia. Number 4 is Jamie McIver, who's a young guy who's really trying hard to change the world in terms of its fuel consumption. And number 5 is Antonio Fernandez, who is an ex-gang leader of the Latin Kings, a street gang in New York. And that was certainly one of my most challenging interviews, and he was very gracious to me when I went in, quite nervous to interview him. My own 5, in no particular order, and this is again off the top of my head, I haven't really given it huge thought, but Antonio would be one of my top 5. I'd also shout out to Craig Smith, a guy who very honestly and forthrightly shared his battles with addiction and alcoholism. I also loved interviewing a guy called Bure in Sarajevo. That was episode 37. That was my own foray into Spinal Tap. It was like my own version of Spinal Tap. I also feel the interview episode 33 with Tavis Sage Eaton, again a guy who was out shooting for his country in the Gulf War and shared his difficulties and issues that he had when he came back, still in his early 20s from a war, and the problems he had and how he came through that. And the final top 5, I couldn't not give a shout out to my partner, the Don, who in episode 85, during the middle of the Irish referendum to repeal the Eighth, she'd never been really on a podcast much before. She's not used to speaking, but she graciously gave her time and wisdom and knowledge on the subject to try and educate people on that particular subject. So they would be my top 5. Other questions I've had is where do all my listeners come from and how many listeners have I? The analytics don't tend to give you great accuracy because there's so many different platforms that people listen on. I have somewhere of the order, I think, of about 5,000 listeners per week, and that goes up and down depending on the episodes. And the biggest countries listened to are the United States, United Kingdom, Ireland. However, one country, and I would like to shout out, I don't really know why I seem to be quite listened to in Vietnam. So hello to all my Vietnam listeners. Vietnam ranks as probably number 6 of countries that listen to A Pint with Seaniebee. So hello to all my listeners there, and thank you for your support. Those of you who are close followers of the show will also notice that I finally succumbed and set up a Patreon account, which you can go to help fund the podcast. The podcast is as I said, a complete labor of love. It does cost me money to put it out there in terms of travel and accommodation and, maintaining websites and stuff like that. So any amount of money you can contribute to that account in Patreon would be absolutely amazing. I always wanted to keep the show ad-free, possibly due to the fact that I feel advertising has killed radio and podcasts are the resurrection of radio in a new guise. I certainly didn't want to be clogging my podcast with gratuitous ads for maybe products I didn't even believe in. So the Patreon account gives me a chance to get some sort of income from the podcast. You can go on there. For some reason, they ask you to pledge on a monthly basis. I've had some people come back saying, well, I don't want to give you money every month, but I will give you a donation. I think the way to do that is just to pledge and then cancel your credit card. I don't know why Patreon don't allow one-off gifts, or they don't seem to. I'm all new to this as well. But anything that you can give, even if it's $1, even if it's the price of a pint, that's the way I like to put it. It's called A Pint with Seaniebee. If you can spot me a pint, I'd be really appreciative of it. So that website again is Patreon, patreon.com/Seaniebee, and you'll be able to contribute there. And everything, no matter how small, is welcome. Okay, on to today's show. And for my 100th episode, I have a presidential candidate, somebody who is running for the presidency of Ireland. The vote will be taking place on the 26th of October, which is not far away. Peter Casey is one of the outsiders of 6 candidates, including the incumbent Michael D Higgins. The Irish Presidency, for overseas listeners, is a largely titular role, but we have, for some reason, 3 businessmen, of which Peter is one, vying to try and take out the incumbent, who originally promised he would only do 7 years and has now said he wants to run for another 7. So you'll get a little bit of the ins and outs of that. Peter Casey is an Irishman who has lived overseas for much of his life. He's a successful businessman. He's done a lot of work in the recruitment business, working with such companies as Tata, and he's a great believer in trying to harness the power of the Irish diaspora. He'll tell you his story. Without further ado, I give you episode 100 of A Pint with Seaniebee. Thank you again, and I hope to see you at episode 200. Here's Peter Casey. This is the 100th episode of A Pint with Seaniebee. I'm in Dublin. I have a very, very interesting guest today. A guy I've known for over 10 years. We met actually at an Irish-American event in New York in about 2008, just as the entire global economy was collapsing. He is a man who is running for President of Ireland. He's only one of 21 people to have ever been on the ballot for President of Ireland, so that is quite the honour. And his name is Peter Casey. How are you, sir?
Thank you very much.
You're about 2 weeks into your campaign. How are you holding up? Are you enjoying it?
Yes, it's been like drinking water from a fire hydrant, So it's amazing how little sleep you need.
And what have been the ups and the downs so far?
There haven't really been any downs. It's nothing that I didn't expect. I knew that you don't just get all nice PR and all nice comments, and you get a lot of negative. But I've got selective amnesia when it comes to my mistakes.
You're hardened.
Yeah, sort of like my investment. I can very conveniently forget the stocks that I've lost a lot of money on. And it's been a great experience. Met a lot of very interesting people. Getting on the ballot was very tough because the Michael D deliberately left it to the very last minute.
Those overseas listeners, Michael D Higgins is our current president, 7 years in the job, and every 7 years it revolves. He only said he was going to do it for 7 years. He's going to run again. There's 5 people running against him. Peter's one of them.
So first of all, the president shouldn't be allowed to nominate himself. Since the state began, it's essentially been a 14-year term instead of a 7-year term, and the president is essentially being it's like a coronation, rather than and so most of the presidents have had 14-year terms, with the exception of Mary Robinson, who cut hers 6 months short. She should take up a plum job in Europe,
But she did very well.
She's a disgrace to the Irish, to the Irish people.
You think so?
Of course. And anybody who's given the honour of being chosen to be the president and then gives up the presidency to take a job in a bureaucratic job in Europe. No, it's just.
But I would have said, like growing up in Ireland, Erskine Childers was the first. De Valera died first of all. Erskine Childers took over. It was an old folks golfing home in the park for people who'd done the state some service, I suppose. And she was the first person, in my view, to come along and do what you guys are all talking about and make it into something
No,
more.
but she without a doubt, she was an inspiration to a lot of women, which was a great thing, and she was an inspiration to a lot of younger generation people who had no idea that the president could actually be a woman, and no idea that the president could actually do something different than being, as you said, an old people's home almost. But then she disgraced her the office by
You mean by leaving early?
by taking a job. It'd be different if she.
But she went on to become a human rights. She represented
She
Ireland on the world stage of human rights at the UN.
She could have done that after her presidency, and I think it was just, if it had been ill health, she would have gone out as a national heroine. But I think she was it's a very good way to, how do you become from a national inspiration to a national embarrassment very quickly, And
what about McAleese then? Did you do?
I think she was a very good ambassador for Ireland, and she represented Ireland well. And I think she was, and she was a very, a great role model for a lot of young women to realise what you can do. And yes, she's definitely.
She's especially recently been very critical of the church.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the Ireland that you're vying to become president of, and its relationship with the church and how that's gone?
The whole thing about the church at the moment, the Pope was here about a month ago, or less than that, and there was the time John Paul II was here, Croke Park in Phoenix Park, there was like over 1 million people.
1 in 3 people went to see him.
Yeah, and then this time around,
more people watching Man United.
Exactly. It was. But I think Ireland is definitely changing. For the better. The Catholic Church is facing a real problem. I don't know if you saw, I tweeted this morning, the Pope came out with a statement saying that, we needed to rectify the wrongs type of thing. As far as I can see, there's no point in apologising for something unless you do something about the thing you're apologising for to make sure it doesn't happen again. It's one thing to say, okay, I'm terribly sorry that, we apologise, we let the little ones down, and you say that, well, look, it's, we need to make sure that these pedophile priests are punished. But the real core of the problem is, that's a symptom of the problem. The problem is the fact that priests are not allowed to get married, and women are treated like second-class citizens, and they're not allowed to become priests. Now, the Pope, if he was genuinely sorry, if he really was genuinely sorry about the disaster that is now the Catholic Church, he could turn around this afternoon at 3 o'clock and say, okay, I want to do something about this. I hereby announce that priests can get married and women can become priests. And he could say that. There's nobody who could stop him.
He's infallible.
He's God's representative on earth. Now, I've said that to a couple of people, and they turn around and say to me, well, he'll be killed. Well, that goes with the turf, John Paul I didn't last too long when he started shaking up the financials.
John Paul II was shot.
Well,
By the Turkish guy,
he was
survived.
shot. He was shot, but a lot of the predecessors, to the role were put to death for their beliefs. And, when you take on a job like that, if you look at the church, the attendances in the church today, all around the world, I've been all around the world this year, I've been around the world 3 times. And everywhere you go, in Sydney, in South Africa, in America, in Ireland, the attendances are down everywhere.
The church is a business, and you're a businessman.
You would think that he would look at it and go, I went to a Nazareth convent there when I was travelling around, and there was 3 nuns now, and there used to be 30. St. Colum's College, where I went to, there was usually 5 or 6 would go on for the priesthood, and before that, I think it was a lot more. They haven't had anybody go on to the priesthood from St. Colum's in the last 10 years.
How would you fix the business of the church?
Well, the bottom line, if you don't fix it, it's not going to be in existence. In 25 years' time.
Are you religious?
I would say spiritual rather than religious. Obviously my parents were very religious, and my wife is fairly religious, I would say. She would go to church probably twice a month. I wouldn't go. I used to take the children to church all the time until they were about 12, and they all went to a Catholic school. And it's interesting, 2 of my children are actually, 3 of them I'd say are very religious, as in one of my sons will say a little prayer before every meal, which actually I find very lovely, My daughters, anything they were all quite religious, and they'd go to church. And surprisingly, one of my daughters, middle daughter, she's actually got her Protestant boyfriend going to church now on Sundays, which I find quite interesting.
Catholic church.
God, yeah, and I would never have. I never even picked her as being particularly religious, but she won't miss church, and I think that's grand. If it gives you, my mother was a daily communicant. She would never miss Mass, Holy Communion all her life.
Let's segue in there because your mother loomed large in your life, and a lot of people on Twitter, who've been following your exploits have been going, who the hell is this guy? He's an American, he's come home. So where were you born and what was it like for you growing up?
Well, I was born in Derry, in Argyle Street, with a little 2 up, 2 down with an outside toilet, we left Argyle Street when I was 6 or 7, so my memories of that are obviously very limited. But then my parents moved to Bishop Street, which is right on the border of the no-go area. So it was part of the no-go area. So the army and the police were not allowed in. After Bloody Sunday, then the no-go areas were established. And the people in those areas elected 12 people to represent them. And my father was one of the 12 people, along with John Hume, Sean Keenan, who was actually he was the OC of the Irish, IRA, the official IRA. Before the IRA split into the official and the provisional IRA. Yeah. And Ivor Canavan was on the Bogside Community Association, even though he didn't live in the Bogside. It struck me as a bit strange. But and he was one of the organisers of the Bloody Sunday March.
So just for overseas again, Bloody Sunday was when it all kicked off in 1968-69 in Northern Ireland. It was a peaceful march in Peter's hometown, which British snipers opened fire and innocent people were killed, and that's generally seen as the sort of the beginning of the modern day troubles, which culminated in the Anglo-Irish Agreement. Peter grew up in the very epicenter of this firefight. It was a firefight, and you grew up a nationalist.
Oh yeah, my uncle by marriage on my father's side was Eddie McAteer, and he was the leader of the Nationalist Party. His other brother, interestingly enough, was Hugh McAteer, who was actually the chief of staff of the IRA, and he was actually the last person to escape from Derry jail back in 1947. Right. So the whole family is very much steeped in republicanism.
There was a story where you nearly weren't with us to this day when you were a young fella.
Yeah, well, there's actually quite a few times. So my mother used to say to me, son, God must have something special for you to do because you shouldn't really be here, And so I actually shot myself when I was about 10 down at my grandfather's house with
in the foot?
No, in the shoulder. No, in my shoulder, and I was in hospital for about a week.
How did that happen?
He had an infestation of rabbits, and so he had a tutu. They used to protect his crop with. He was sitting out in the garage one day and he was working on the lawnmower, and I picked it up. I didn't realise it was loaded. Anyway, ended up went off and hit me in the shoulder, and
it was Dick Cheney.
Yeah,
Dick Cheney-esque.
Well, that would have been Dick Cheney.
So you survived that, but there was something you told me about much more serious when you were in the middle of a.
Well, we used to go riding every day after school down to William Street. I was probably about 13, 14. We called it the matinee. Like, you'd go down after school, you'd throw stones at the soldiers. The soldiers with William Street, they would shoot rubber bullets and tear gas, and then you'd throw more stones at them, and then the rubber bullets were actually, my first sort of commercial endeavour was actually selling rubber bullets.
Really?
Well, there was sort of honour amongst thieves. If you were hit, you were given the bullet. So if you were hit with a rubber bullet, and you didn't get it, you'd be given it, type of thing.
They sound a lot tamer than they are, because they're pretty vicious, aren't they?
If you get them close up, they are. The theory is that they're supposed to hit them in the ground, they bounce up, and they're supposed to hit you in the legs and that sort of thing. But they were just firing them straight at you in the head. There was. I'm not aware of anybody actually dying with them, but Now the plastic bullets were different. That's they were very lethal, and some people did die of the plastic bullets because they would definitely take part of your head off if you hit with one of those at short range. But there was one time we were rioting down in William Street, and the Saracen was halfway down behind a building, and it sort of half of it was popped out and half of it was, and then behind it was a big empty space where a building had been burnt down, and a rubber bullet ricocheted off a wall and ricocheted behind the Saracen, you see. So I was about maybe 30-40 yards from the Saracen. We were throwing stones at it, and I ran to get the rubber bullet, which was the other side of the Saracen, and a guy called Mad Dog, that was his nickname, he didn't see me run behind the Saracen, and he threw a nail bomb at it, and it landed right beside went over the Saracen and landed between me and the Saracen, and I thought, oh shit. So I had two choices: either run around and get to the other side of the Saracen, or try and just lie down, and so I made a split-second decision to run, and I ran straight over a fizzling nail bomb, and dived behind the wall, and it went off about 2 seconds later, So I went home that night and my ears were all over the place, pop. But it was very lucky, and yeah, there's so that.
Were you put under pressure as a kid to join the IRA?
Not really, I mean, it was more a case of, so the timeline was that the first riot, the first march and sort of riot in Derry was October the 5th, 1968, right? And then the marches became more prevalent and more often, And the thing that really stimulated, that kicked it all off, it was they made a decision to put the University of Ulster in Coleraine instead of Derry, which would have been the logical second home, because Derry was the second city, of course. But it was a political decision, when you consider there's 100,000 people in Derry and there's 30,000 people in Coleraine. Yeah. And all the people in Derry would have to go to Coleraine,
But Coleraine was earmarked for development then, wasn't it?
They kind of
dismissed Derry.
It was more a case of Colerane's obviously a very Protestant town, and the topology of Derry is the correct dividing line when they were doing the partition. It should have been the River Foyle, and of course what happened was, unfortunately for the Protestants, their Jerusalem, so to speak, is the ancient city, the historic city of Derry, where King William, freed the city, and that's the history, and that's we will not no surrender, and that's the epicenter of loyalism, their Jerusalem, as it were. But the Protestants all live on the East Bank, and the Catholics are on the West Bank, which is another interesting parallel with the Jewish situation.
And let's go there. Your main platform, and in fairness, you've had this ever since I've known you, to be honest. You've had this idea since certainly 10 years, is that there are 75 million people globally who claim to be of Irish descent. There's 1.5 million people who were born here who live overseas. Mm-hmm. This is in a population in Ireland now of about 5 million.
Yeah.
You used to always refer to the Jewish people as around 12 million, and you were always very positive on how they have galvanized as a people globally. Mm-hmm. And you said it would be great if the Irish could do this. And of course, as soon as you got called over for being anti-Semitic, and as soon as you say anything, you do tend to get this coming out. But I know that you're not, and I know that you meant it just as this comparison, right? Talk to me a little bit about just clarifying that point.
It's amazing how journalists can spin things, and they take things completely out of context and put, obviously they get up in the morning, they've got an empty sheet of paper and they have to fill it up or they get fired, But I was down in Kerry, and a guy called Pa Daly, a councillor called Pa Daly, he came out and he said, I would never vote for Peter Casey. He said he'd give Trump a warm Irish welcome when he visits Ireland, and any friend of Trump is not a friend of Kerry, He took it completely out of context, because I was asked would I meet Trump when he came to, and I said, of course, if the Taoiseach has invited him as his guest to Ireland, And as president, I absolutely would meet with him and I'd see him. I think the man is absolutely an embarrassment to the United States. He's a serial womanizer and a women abuser. But if he comes to Ireland, he'll get a warm Irish welcome. And I'll remind him that
no matter who the president,
no matter who it is, there's a respect for the office of the president, not the man himself. And I would remind him that we've got 50,000 Irish people who are undocumented who can't come home for funerals, and I can influence 40 million people.
But go back to this.
But getting back to it, so on the clarification, sorry, I segued into that. So there's such an amazing, and there are so many parallels between the Irish people and the Jewish people. Both have suffered enormously. Obviously, the Jewish people's suffering at the Holocaust is beyond comparison. But we suffered greatly as a nation through English occupation and forced a lot of Irish people that had to leave, had to go in the famine ships, and it was just horrendous. That's the sort of thing. Unfortunately, we had to endure. But if you look at what the Jewish people have been able to achieve by being bonded together, there's a solidarity there that is just, you can't but just take. It's so amazing. They're so passionate about supporting each other. That's the sort of passion that I would love to see the Irish people taking a leaf out of their book. And it's no. They had Facebook 1,000 years before Facebook came along, and that's what I would like to achieve. Now, apparently, you can't use the word Jewish people in Ireland anymore because of the Palestinians.
Well, where do you stand on that? I mean, what's interesting about the Palestine-Israel situation versus the Irish-British situation is that in America, progressive Americans, for obvious reasons, because of these millions of Irish people who consider themselves Irish in America, they tend to side with us, with the Irish nationalist in the Northern Irish situation. And yet in Israel, again, because of the importance of the Jewish vote in America, they tend to side with Israel against the Palestinians. We, as a nation, tend to side with the Palestinians because that kind of makes more sense. They were the ones who considered themselves to have been invaded. And yes, before everyone starts getting on my case, there is contentious issues about this, but generally speaking, that is a discussion. And there's a hypocrisy there between America and what goes on, which is everyone just ignores it.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt in my mind that the reason for the troubles in the Middle East is the dire poverty of the Palestinian people. And that to me is so frustrating because you look at the Middle East and you see such incredible displays of ostentatious consumption. You've been to Dubai, you've been to Saudi Arabia, and you look at it and you go, there's just so much money there. There's so much wealth there. And, it wouldn't take too much money for, Saudi Arabia could solve the problem of Palestine tomorrow. Just giving it, writing a check that they wouldn't even notice that they'd written. Just put in 100 billion into Palestine and build the infrastructure, build hospitals, build hotels, build universities. They wouldn't even notice they'd written the check.
And Israel would say about that?
I genuinely think that Israel would like to have a peaceful and situation. I don't think Israel necessarily, they're sitting there getting Scud missiles or missiles fired at them, and now obviously they overreact when they get missiles fired on them. And I'm not for 1 second condoning the overreaction of Israel, but if we were sitting in New York, if people started shooting missiles from Canada
might start happening soon.
Well, if they started, if Canada started lobbing missiles into the United States, you have to think that America would be fairly aggressive in their, So if there was a huge investment in Palestine by the wealthy Arab states, they claim that they're all brothers, and but they don't really share the love, the wealth, the money. And I say they wouldn't even notice they'd written the check, and then they're criticizing America for cutting off funding to Palestine. Why doesn't their Arab states help their fellow Arabs?
There is this hypocrisy of thinking between our country and what's going on out there. It's a very interesting solution. One thing I'm not going to let you away with, Peter,
Yes.
is your views on Irish neutrality. Okay, so this is a nice segue from missiles.
Yeah.
You're on record so far in this campaign as saying you find neutrality irrelevant. I don't understand why it could be irrelevant. That we need to pay our way in NATO, that we should join NATO.
Yes.
And I find that, as an Irish citizen, fucking scary. Excuse my French.
Yeah. Well, you're prone to overreaction. You're prone to, you probably believe in goblins behind, in bed at night. I mean, the reality is that there's several major powers in the world, and there's the Chinese, there's the Russians, and there's the Americans. And at the end of the day, those are the three powers, superpowers in terms of military force, military might, of which obviously America is by far the strongest. Europe is aligned with America through NATO. You're being disingenuous if you, for 1 second, think that Ireland can defend itself. Ireland.
Oh, I know that.
Ireland can't defend itself. It's a total waste of money, Ireland having an air force. We've got 17 fixed wing aircraft, right?
But that's not the issue. I mean, I know we've got hardly any army. Why is neutrality irrelevant?
Neutral is totally irrelevant. It's basically, the Irish are not a nation of sandbaggers. We are proud people. We pay our bills. God knows we pay our bills. We were forced to even pay bills we shouldn't have been paying, if you look at the bondholders, Right. But anyway, it's an anachronistic, it's an outdated concept. There's no such thing as neutrality. Ireland is not neutral. Ireland is part of a global community, and we're aligned with America and NATO and Europe. And for us to pretend that, we're neutral, nobody gives a flying monkeys whether you're neutral or not. The bottom line is you have to, you're serious about defending your nation, and you can't afford to do it yourself, as you've just conceded that you can't afford ourselves, then defend ourselves. Then, the second best thing is to get somebody else to defend you, which is exactly what we're doing. At the end of the day, if somebody wanted to invade Ireland, we would rely on Britain and America, NATO, to defend us.
But forgive me, there's nobody going to invade.
Exactly. And therefore...
would you... a military base on the Salty Islands, a US military base.
Exactly. But
would you be up for that?
If we're serious about our national defence, then we have to partner with somebody who can defend us. There's three choices. You can have China, you can have Russia, or you can have NATO. And now, so we've got NATO, de facto by default. Now, Greece is paying their 2% for their defence.
Greece is butting up against a very volatile Turkey.
Well, that's one of the reasons why
it's got a war over one of its islands in Cyprus. It's got issues.
Well, but the bottom, we are getting defended by NATO. Are we or are we not?
Yes, but
exactly.
Okay.
So therefore, you've just accepted that we're getting defended by NATO, and therefore we should pay our 2%. It's not something I really feel that strongly about. It's an issue that I raised and just said, it's something that we should look at. If we're going to be a responsible member of the international community, we should pay what everyone else pays.
You talked a bit about, the idea that if the government goes rogue and, these are the kind of language that's used in America when it comes to gun control. The reason that the right to bear arms was put into the Constitution was to defend yourself. Back in the day, our government won't go rogue. It's almost like, would we have a more relaxed gun control here in Ireland? I mean, I know these are things outside the presidency, but I'm interested just in your views on them.
You're referring to a comment that I made when I was given an explanation to how it pertained to the powers of the president. The president is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces.
Army.
Well, he's the commander-in-chief. He doesn't have the control day-to-day of the defence forces. That is under the jurisdiction of the Minister for Defence. Now, the reason that the Constitution was written the way it is that the Army and the armed forces, they swear allegiance to the President and not to the Taoiseach. And it was put in with Northern Ireland in mind, so that if the government of the day decided to invade Northern Ireland, the President could step in and say no, and he can override the government of the day. And the only instance where that would have any bearing would be in the event that something was to go on with Northern Ireland. And that was the reason it was put into the Constitution. And that's what I was referring to. And I was explaining to a journalist, because he was asking me why this,
Sean was asking you.
So that I was explaining.
Okay, we'll move on, except to say that I would say to you that NATO is becoming irrelevant in many ways, in a sense that the sort of wars we'll be fighting in the future will be very different wars. We also, luckily, I mean, there's loads of exceptions, and Russia's behaving weirdly, and there's lots of things that could go off, but there's always been that. But the nature of humanity is that we're learning that wars don't really work.
I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with you. I mean, I think if you look at what happened, in Bosnia, Herzegovina, if it wasn't for NATO stepping in...
It wasn't for America, I think.
Well,
Europe made an absolute mess of that.
Yeah, and that's an example now where, if we were paying our way and being a responsible member of the European community, which everybody says we want to be a member of the European community, there's a little price tag that goes along with it.
The idea that we do so much in the UN, we've paid our way there, peacekeepers. We'll move on. You just mentioned Brexit. How do you feel it's going to impact Ireland?
I was of the opinion that it was going to be like the Y2K crisis, the crisis you have when you're not having a crisis, and that the whole thing, you remember that drink in Australia, Clayton's, the drink you're having when you're not having a drink, And I thought it was going to be a Clayton's issue, and that basically they would kick the can down the road, give Britain another 2 years to negotiate an exit, and then in the meantime, the government would be kicked out and there'd be another referendum, and this time they'd vote to stay in. The logic was that the justification of having another referendum was that they said people didn't know what they were voting for, which is a bit insulting to the people who voted the first time round. You're now saying that we didn't think you were very intelligent the first time, and you've suddenly developed an intelligence gene that you didn't have previously. So, I think that's insulting to the British people. So I wouldn't be in favour of another referendum. Just philosophically, I think it's the wrong thing to do. People spoke and they should be listened to.
What about the argument that what they were voting on was misinformation?
Well, I don't think that it was misinformation. The reason, and everybody's been too politically correct to say, the reason they voted the way they voted was because they were tired of Germany being top dog and Germany sort of dominating everything. And they looked around and saw that Germany had brought down 5 governments without firing a single bullet. So they were looking at that and going, we're proud British, and there has been whether you like it or not, there's been a sort of swing towards nationalism and more right wing, and it was more a reflection of that. The fact that they didn't understand the microeconomics of it is not really the issue. Yes, they didn't understand the microeconomics of it. I appreciate that, and nobody could have possibly understood it. But interestingly enough, I was a member of the Good Friday Peace team, a delegation to the White House. And we looked and discussed every possible scenario when we were talking about, how it would evolve. We looked at an independent Ulster that would break away but would be part of Europe. We looked at every single sort of what-if scenario. The one scenario that no one put on the table was what happens if Britain decides to leave the EU. Nobody even thought of it because they didn't even think it was remotely possible that would happen. And now you've got a strange situation where you've got Michel Barnier saying there must be a backstop. Now, he's a bureaucrat, by the way. He's not an elected official. He's appointed by the Commission to negotiate this. He's saying there must be a backstop. And then you've got the Unionists in Northern Ireland saying there must be no border between England and Northern Ireland. And then you've got Sinn Féin in favour of staying in the EU as well. They could torpedo Brexit if they wanted to. They've got 6 Sinn Féin, members of Parliament, and they could go over and vote and overturn the government, and Theresa May would be out of office. And they're not doing it. And then you've got, of course, Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach here. He's been assured by Michel Barnier that there will not be a border in the island of Ireland. Now, how can you give that commitment to Leo and say there will not be a border in the island of Ireland, and at the same time Barnier is saying there must be a backstop? If a backstop equals border, people need to stop using 2 terms simultaneously because it's confusing people. Backstop equals border. Barnier is saying there must be a backstop, and then on the other hand they tell Leo there'll never be a border. And that the Good Friday Agreement, it's semantics. If there is a backstop and a border, it has to be enforced. Even if they say it's a technological border, you put cameras on, people will shoot out the cameras, okay? And they'll throw stones at the cameras and they'll break the cameras. People will have to be put in to protect the cameras. That means people will be on the ground.
Sentry post.
And there'll be a sentry post. People will start attacking the sentry post. And then we're back pretty much to where we were 20 years ago. And that's why it's disingenuous. Now, putting it in perspective, the GDP of Northern Ireland is 60 billion. The GDP of the combined EU community is 17.9 trillion. You know, it's not even a rounding error. It's such an insignificant, such a small, insignificant thing. Now, the problem is, though, if Britain leaves, then everybody could ship all their goods into Northern Ireland, and there'd be no taxes on it because we could, from America into Northern Ireland, and then there'd be no border to stop them flowing into the Republic of Ireland and then on into Europe. So Ireland would basically be a pathway through, Where's the solution? I genuinely think that the more likely scenario is the one I talked about, where they'll kick it down the road for a couple of years, another election, and they'll vote to return it. But if that doesn't happen, the only solution that I can see is a UDI, an independent declaration, unilateral declaration of independence. Northern Ireland would be part of the Commonwealth.
And then presumably Scotland follows.
Well, that's the reason that Britain doesn't want to go down that route, because Scotland would then immediately follow, and Wales, in all probability, would follow.
Wales, do we have to? Oh, all right.
And so that's the reason that Britain doesn't want to go down that route, because that would cause a total breakup of the United Kingdom as we know it. However, I think that is the only solution if we don't have the first scenario, because then you'd have Northern Ireland would be part of the EU. Britain would support the funding of the new state of Northern Ireland, along with Brussels and the European community, because Northern Ireland is a complete financial basket case. The last thing the public wants is to have an extra 15-20 billion onto its paper, and so they definitely don't want that. And so that scenario, interestingly enough, though, would essentially lead you to de facto a united Ireland, because Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, would all be part of the EU. And there'd be
they'd be separate countries.
They'd be separate countries, but it'd be really like a county council. I mean, there's a very good possibility that Kerry could break away, and form the Kingdom of Kerry, and Cork, and why
Cork will follow suit.
Well, if you look at
and Leitrim,
Galway. I mean, look at Galway, Cork. They're such huge counties, but that's the only solution that I can see to it.
What's your prediction?
They'll kick it down the road.
Okay, now, before we finish, I want to talk about the presidency specifically, but I also want to talk about a couple of things. One, I was away for 26 years.
Yes.
And I came back 2 years ago, and I noticed that things that were a problem in 1996 when I left, crumbling education system in need of reform, which I know you have big ideas about.
Yeah.
A health system that's still creaking at the seams. They were talking about people on waiting lists on trolleys way back then.
Yeah.
A homelessness situation that has got embarrassing, and for some reason a refusal by something sinister in the capitalism of makeup of our country that refuses to make free houses for people, in my view. That's become an embarrassment. A lack of creativity in government and a lack of action.
Mm-hmm.
And those 5 things, in my view, and I've spoken on this podcast before about it, are still the problem that we have in this country today.
Mm-hmm.
The president is not expected to fix them, but I want to get your point of view. Let's start with education, because I know you have some big ideas there where you may be able to affect change, and also homelessness, which is starting to become a global embarrassment, I think.
Well, education, we talked a little bit about the revolution that's going to take part in education through MOOCs and whatnot. If you look at the cost of education, it's spiraling now to the levels where not just, and it's overlapping with the housing issue, but you look at the cost of living as a student in Dublin. I mean, it's off the charts. Yeah. It's not just the education, it's having, that's what students now, if you don't live in Dublin, and you're able to live at home with your parents, it's prohibitive. So we need to lower the cost of education. the MOOCs platform we've talked about will absolutely do that.
Peter's proposing massive open online courses, which is a relatively new thing that leverages the internet and puts courses online for free to a huge audience, including much of Africa. Will hopefully be educated this way. But it does have some teething problems in the sense a lot of people don't tend to finish, and they don't have the kind of the motivation to get up every day and go to college. And there are some issues with it, although AI and stuff like that may set that straight. You talk about the land of saints and scholars, and we should be using our universities to utilize technology to become global players. Is that fair?
Exactly. I mean, it's essentially the modularization of degree courses. So you can do a part of your degree in Sydney, Australia, and then you can come over and do a module in Dublin or in Limerick or Galway or wherever your parents came from originally. Yeah. And they'll give you a chance to bond with your relatives, your parents' relatives. But you then go back to Sydney or wherever you came from, and you'd get the credit for the semester that you spent over here. And that would be another way of stoking and fueling the Irish sort of nationalism.
And you also have the Birthright program. Just give a quick explanation of that.
Birthright program is very simple. Again, emulating the Israeli birth. They have a similar program, and you go over to Ireland, spend a month in Ireland. In the summer, you'll go and spend 2 weeks in the Gaeltacht in rural Ireland, understand, what it's like to live in rural Ireland, and then go up to Derry and Belfast, understand the history of the Troubles and the conflict, and then go down to Dublin and spend a week in Dublin and see how amazingly beautiful Dublin is, and just soak up the experience of the culture in Dublin, and then go back to Sydney or South Africa or wherever you're from, and then they'll be all pumped up and so proud.
But there's an assumption based into this diaspora are all wealthy. They're
it's
not. You are, but I know your kids are all very respectful of the price of a dollar. I know that. You've instilled that in them, you and Helen. But they're not all wealthy. They don't have the money to just be sending their kids over for a jolly over to Ireland.
You start off with the wealthy ones, and and there's a lot of wealthy ones, Once the program gets going, it'll be self-funding, and this is exactly what happened in Israel. The government realised this is a money spinner. This is a real little earner here, and now they've had over 600,000 young Jewish people have gone to Israel since the program began in 1998. So that's an amazing. In 20 years, there's 600,000 have gone.
Oh, wait, but what about the idea that the Irish people don't like Irish Americans? They don't like them.
That is just not true.
Well, they contribute a lot. They come over here and they look for the little babbling brook where their grandfather was born, their green jerseys, and we look after them. But it's all a bit paddy-whackery, and the Gathering was a good example, which was a shakedown. I thought.
I think the Gathering was a little bit of a shakedown to an extent, I suppose. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it is a phenomenal opportunity to, you look at people like Chuck Feeney.
Yeah, Chuck worked very under the radar.
Yeah, absolutely. But he still gave $2 billion to education in Ireland. $2 billion to education.
Chuck Feeney didn't come running in with his leprechaun flags waving, going, look at all the money I'm putting into Limerick University. He didn't do it that way. He did it more in a JP McManus kind of under the table quiet way.
JP wasn't that much under the table now. It was in every newspaper, TV, radio station. But
early JP.
But in fairness to JP, anybody who gives money away deserves any accolades that goes with it.
Have you given money away?
I have indeed,
What are some of the charities you've been involved in?
Well, actually, we've got one next week that we're sponsoring. It's Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. It's a golf tournament. We've been sponsoring that for probably 15 years now. Mm-hmm. There's an orphanage in Africa that we've been sponsoring in Yeovil, in Johannesburg. It's for children who've got HIV. And we've run golf tournaments and just sent money to them, I think it's important if you have something to give back.
Yeah.
And, there's absolutely no doubt that what you give comes back tenfold. I've absolutely no doubt in my mind and I've noticed. I remember one time when things were really bad after 9/11, and the company was hit really, really big time. After 9/11, there was just a massive sort of analysis paralysis in the IT that spent so much money.
Peter's business is called. I think he's left it now to run, but Claddagh Resources, which were very big in recruitment, did a lot of work with Tata, one of the most respected companies in the world out of India. I want to go back and finish that point about Irish Americans. Maybe I was a bit mean to them, but the issue is, Peter, that we have... There's a lot of people in America who look at Ireland through green-tinted spectacles. They look at an Ireland that was, John Wayne and the Quiet Man and the famine. Ireland today has just voted to relax its very severe abortion laws. We've just been one of the first countries in the world to make same-sex marriage a thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's a different Ireland today,
and
I'm 50 and I've come home and I find it different, and I find myself a little bit out of touch.
So, so what word do you? I mean, yes, it is different, of course. I mean, Ireland today is 17% of the people in Ireland today were not born in Ireland. 25% of the people living in Dublin were not born in Ireland. Wow. 33% of the people working in Dublin were not born in Dublin. 33% of the working population in Dublin were not born in Dublin. Yeah, now Ireland has been the recipient of such incredible generosity over the decades, and I think it's only fair that we open our arms to people to come in and share the Irish experience. I put in the caveat, by the way, that it's important. We have something incredibly special. Our Irish culture, our Irish history, so I would say to people coming from foreign countries, you're most welcome, but don't try and change us. If you want to change us, stay where you are. I'm very proud of the Irish culture, the Irish traditions, but don't try and change us. Accept our culture, accept our traditions, accept the way we are, and, learn our language, and then be part of, not necessarily Gaelic, but English.
Not necessarily Irish.
Not necessarily Irish, because, you can't expect them to learn a language that only 2% of the population...
Indeed. You have committed to saying you're going to learn it if you become president, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And how do you fix homelessness? I have to ask that because it's driving me nuts.
Well, the problem with homelessness, you have to look at the symptoms and then look at the reason for the problem. A bit like the Catholic Church, There's symptoms, which is paedophiles and that, and with homelessness, it's a complete lack of infrastructure spend in rural Ireland. In other words, if we had made rural Ireland much more attractive for people to live in, more attractive for companies to put their businesses there, you wouldn't have this overheating, overconcentration of Dublin. At the moment, people are having to travel. I spoke to a young lady yesterday. She was spending 1 hour and 45 minutes getting to and from work. 3 hours a day of her life that she'll never get back. We need to make it so that rural Ireland is attractive to businesses, attractive to young people setting up their families. And to do that, we need to put the IT infrastructure in there. There needs to be, it's one of the things that really frustrates me. We completely messed up the whole telecom broadband, situation. We should have gone straight to 4G. We spent hundreds of millions of euros putting cable in the ground that we'll never get back. In 5 years' time, we'll be going, why did we waste all this money putting cable? But if we built up the infrastructure properly, like for example, it takes me about 4 hours now to get to my home in Donegal. You get motorway to Belfast, and after that, the A5 is like a nightmare, and you're going through all these little towns and villages, and you get stuck behind tractor trailers, and it's just brutal. But if we invested in the infrastructure so that rural Ireland was attractive, you can get a beautiful 4-bedroomed house, like with water views, in Donegal for 100,000. Yeah. And in Dublin, you wouldn't get a 1-bedroomed apartment. You've got a situation now where people who are born in Dublin, reared in Dublin, and they can't afford to live in Dublin. Because, there's this massive over-concentration in the IT sector particularly, right, and pharmaceuticals. And, Microsoft, for example, announced that they're creating 250 new jobs. That's such a lie. There's not 250 new jobs. They're going to go out and pinch people from other firms, and that creates a vacancy. They'll go to somebody at Salesforce, say, look, I've got this great job at Microsoft. Oh, I'm very happy where I am. I will give you another 20%. So, of course, you'll go from Salesforce over to Microsoft. That leaves a vacancy at Salesforce. Then Salesforce goes to the person who's working at Accenture. Oh, got this great job over here. Oh, I'm very happy at Accenture. But we'll give you another 20%. And they go, oh, and then there's a vacancy. So it's musical chairs going upwards and upwards in the salary level. What that does is it pushes people off the bottom of the rungs. People that were just about to get in the rung, house prices have gone up another 15-20%, and they can't get on the ladder. And I think the politicians are lying when it's deceitful. When they turn around, the minister announced 250 new jobs. They're not new jobs. They're recycling existing jobs and putting up the wage levels. If those jobs were based in Drogheda, if they were based in Kildare, if they were based outside of Dublin, then yes, they'd be great. But they're not. They're just pushing up the rental prices
but
in
if
Dublin.
a new company comes in and sets up in Dublin and hires 200 people, that means there's 200 extra jobs in the universe of jobs in Dublin.
No, it would only be
doesn't
that.
mean that there's
it would only be
another
that,
company
no,
is reducing.
It's not as if there's 200 people sitting there waiting for a job. There's not in Dublin in the IT sector. There's not. There's a chronic shortage. So, for example, I was playing golf with a colleague in Atlanta, and he's a CFO of a company called Runtime, very switched on supply chain company. And he said to me, we're looking to set up in Ireland. I said, where? He said, Dublin. I said, absolutely, don't even think of Dublin. He said, why not? I said, first of all, you'll have to pay much more for your office space. You'll have to pay much more for your staff. And the most important thing is you'll have a higher turnover of staff because they'll be pinched all the time by your competitors, And he said, where do you recommend? I said, look at one of the towns surrounding, so look at somewhere like Dundalk, Drogheda, handy for the airport, and you can get in and out quickly. And you can get into Dublin when you want to go to Dublin. He said, well, all my clients are in Dublin. I said, not a problem. You can get in, to see them. It's a reverse commute if you wait till after the traffic hour, and you'll know.
You take a creaky train.
So he ended up going to Waterford. So Written Match set up in Waterford. We helped staff them up in Waterford.
But how do we fix homelessness?
By focusing infrastructure spend on rural Ireland.
Outside of Dublin.
Yes. Now, in the short term, I don't know where this concept came in that everybody had to be given a home. I mean, that wasn't the case when you were growing up in Ireland. It wasn't the case certainly when I was growing up.
There are people in society who can't be the success story that you were, who can't come from the bog side of Derry and build a business because they're not smart enough. They don't have an IQ high enough. They haven't had the opportunity. It's not a meritocracy.
Does that mean you have to give them a home?
Yes.
Why do you have to give them a home? Why do you have to give them a home in Dublin? Why not give them? Why not
kids
give
go
them?
to school in Dublin?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe.
Why do we let Dublin become the most expensive city in Europe?
Well, you have to face the realities. It's one of the most expensive cities in Europe. So, I'm sorry.
But why have we let that happen?
Well, because we haven't been spending the money on infrastructure spend in rural Ireland. You're not going to fix the housing problem in Ireland, Dublin, short term. I mean, yes, there's some things you could do short term that would, that would help. So, for example, putting timber frame houses up. They talk about affordable housing. Timber frame houses can be put up in a matter of weeks. They're not made of bricks and mortar. They're made of timber frame, and you can put stucco on them, and they'll last for 70 to 80 years. And they're better for heating and insulation, everything. But people
are not even doing that.
They're not even doing that.
Well, why shouldn't every Irish citizen, in the Constitution maybe, have the right to shelter? And the government... taxes have to deliver on that.
Then you should go to Cuba. They do that in Cuba.
I'm not, the answer is not Marxism. The answer is humanity and compassion.
No. The answer is that there's no God-given right to own a house and a home. I don't see it as that.
But what happens then?
People
live on the side of the road.
No, you can rent. You can rent.
Okay, what about the person who has no money, who does drugs, has got mental health issues, who has 2 children, she's a single mom, and she can't...
Well, you create this...
What do we do with them?
You create... you've got this situation now, and, it started so you can't put the genie back into the bottle.
What started though?
It's now got to the stage where a person will turn down a 2-bedroom home because they want a 3-bedroom home.
But who's doing that?
Oh, there's lots of people doing that.
Out of the 10,000?
I've talked to lots of counsellors all around Ireland. They tell me the same thing is happening. People, will get themselves on the waiting list for a house when they're in their early 20s, knowing that eventually by the time they get to their late 20s, they'll have been able to turn down 1 or 2 so they get a 2 or 3-bedroom home. I don't know where...
So we've
there's this culture
10,000 homeless right now. It sounds like a capitalist excuse as to why we're not building.
I don't think we have 10,000 homeless. and
or in temporary accommodation.
And the idea of our homeless people being put up in hotels and complaining about them being in hotels. I mean, I'm still trying to work my mind around why people complain about being put up in a hotel.
Yeah, they're often in shitty hotels, miles from where the kids go to school. The mothers have to leave the hotel and come back that night.
The reality,
they're curfewed at 10 o'clock.
The reality,
no, that is the reality.
Yeah, but the reality is that people need to understand that this problem in Dublin is not going to go away anytime soon.
And it's not just Dublin.
No, it's mostly Dublin.
It's not. See, this is the issue.
No, but we don't have very much homelessness in Donegal now.
There are still some people homeless in Donegal.
Very few, though.
Okay, but
very few.
It's a national problem because capitalism has protected property and refuses to build free or give someone a free house.
Giving somebody something for free isn't necessarily the solution to any problem. People tend to not appreciate things that they're given for free, and that. As I said earlier, I don't believe you can't put that genie back into the bottle.
You can by building social housing.
Well, social housing, people will, not respect if you give them something for nothing. And why should you give people?
If I don't have a home and someone gives me a home, I will be forever in debt to them.
I have heard so many councillors complain that people are turning down houses because they want a better house somewhere else.
Well, you said that.
That is...
I disagree with you. I'm sure it has happened.
You haven't got the experience that I have of going around the councils. I have gone around the councils on 2 separate occasions now in the last 3 years. I know many of them very, very well, and they tell me the same thing.
But the councils are part of the problem, that none of the houses are being built. We'll leave it at that one and we'll beg to differ. I want to come back to your election, because to be fair to Peter, a lot of the things we talked about here, and he knows this, so I'm not, the presidential job is largely titular, and these guys, there's 4 people running against the incumbent Michael D Higgins. 5 people running, 4 plus Peter running against him, and it is a titular role, and we've covered some of the responsibilities, but largely it's representing Ireland. Peter's in a hurry now, I can see he's checking his phone. I want to ask one question before we go. You drove a golf ball into Lough Foyle, and you got 110,000 views last week on it, and it was a funny video, and you jumped in tongue-in-cheek to find the golf ball. You're to your point about undoing a wrong when you make one. The Irish Times today has an opinion piece which you said you hadn't seen, but there was a line which says, "From the outset it has been clear that in a comparatively weak field, the biggest obstacle to Michael D Higgins' re-election is complacency or self-inflicted damage." Gavin Duffy, when he launched his campaign, made a big song and dance yesterday about the fact that he and his wife have never done anything embarrassing or that might embarrass their children. You said this is the only driver I'm bringing into the Auras. What are we all missing here? There's something going on because I can smell it. Or are you all just playing the game? It's now in the Irish Times. That is a sea change of support from Michael D Higgins as a shoo-in. You have said from the start that he's not going to get re-elected. I'm getting all these little sort of... Maybe I'm misreading. Am I misreading everything?
Do you know, I was in a taxi the other day, and the taxi drivers, as you know, if you really want to understand what people are thinking and feeling, talk to a taxi driver or talk to a hairdresser. Yeah. And the taxi driver said to me, he said, "Peter, I just heard you on the radio there." He said, you were very impressive, very impressive. He said, "I won't be voting for you, but you were very impressive." I said, "Well, why would you not vote for me?" He said, "I don't think we should have a fucking president." I said, "Why not?" "Actually, it does nothing. Costs us a fortune. Does nothing. Costs a fortune." That's the impression that I believe the vast majority of people in Dublin probably think. And of course,
I would disagree. I think he's one of the issues. I would say is he's great at promoting the arts.
The arts is not where Ireland is at now. We need somebody who understands international business, international relationships, international finance and funding. Somebody who can help sell, corporate Ireland. Somebody who can tie the diaspora together. Somebody who can really, we have an opportunity.
Somebody who can turn us into Luxembourg.
Somebody who can make us really fight above our weight. That's what we need. This president has done absolutely nothing. Now, the biggest indictment of him is that a taxi driver says we shouldn't have a president. But, and you ask people, so what did he do that you really liked? Oh, sure, he was great with the Queen. I mean, great with the Queen. I mean, if you meet the Queen, you're told where to stand, you're told where to sit, you're told what to do, you're told when to shake her hand, you're told, and what not to do. I mean, anybody could be great with the Queen,
What am I missing?
I think that, there's obviously...
Is it the money?
No,
you're Adam at the money, that he's spending too much. You said you send the salary back, which to me sounds a worrying precedent that says this is a role for rich people. There's an argument that could say that. What does the next person say? No, I actually need the money. John Freeman.
No, I have said. I just clarify that one point, and then obviously, I've said that the president absolutely should get paid a salary, but I just think it's wrong that he gets paid such a ridiculous salary. It's much more than the Taoiseach, and that's wrong, and that shouldn't be the case. And that needs to be rectified. His expenses need to be visible. People need to see what they're getting, what he's using the money for. It came up that he's gotten 317,000 spent, 317,000, and nobody knows what it's for. He takes his driver with him everywhere, we don't need to be paying for his driver to be going on international trips.
This was your driver reference.
This was my driver reference there.
Is there something else? There may not be, but I'm just...
I don't know, Sean. You know the situation as well as I do about his driver, but I don't think his driver should be going with him on all his international trips and being put up in a hotel, at the taxpayer's expense. The driver should stay at home, or in your golf bag, but it shouldn't be going on trips with you.
Listen, good luck with the rest of your campaign. Peter Casey launches his campaign tomorrow, Friday, in Dublin. The election is when? The 25th?
26th, and we'll hopefully get a good result on the 28th.
He'll be debating against Michael D Higgins, I think 2 or 3 times, by the looks of it, because I think he's agreed to come on.
No, he's actually said he's not.
Oh, he's not coming now?
He's not coming.
Do you think that's unfair?
I think he's obviously got something to hide, and I think hopefully what he's hiding will come out before the election date. So who knows? But I think it's disgraceful that he's not prepared to come and tell. He went to meet a member of the British royal family rather than tell the Irish people why he deserved another 7 years. He went to meet. He wasn't. It'd be different if he perhaps had a pre-arranged meeting with the Queen. I could go get over that. But he's meeting number 10 to the throne. What did they talk about at that meeting that was so important? That was more important than telling the Irish people what he'd done for the last 7 years and what he's going to do for the next 7 years. The taxi driver was right. We would be much better off without a president like the one we have, because he's eroding the presidency. And that's why he doesn't deserve another 7 years.
Thank you for being on a Pint with Seaniebee.
My pleasure. Thanks, Sean.